my background is in newspapers. And I started at a very small newspaper in Zanesville, Ohio, first, covering a variety of beats. And from there, I moved on to the Cincinnati Enquirer, which was like the big city for me. And that was a really exciting, vibrant newsroom full of, I had some really smart, amazing colleagues there who were great reporters, but hard news wasn't really my thing. So from there, I moved on to Palm Springs, California, where I worked for the Desert Sun. And at the Desert Sun, that was my first foray into feature writing. And I was writing about Coachella and the film festival and cocktails and all sorts of fun things. But after a while, even that gets formulaic. And I had always wanted to travel. And then a few things just happened in my life where I thought, I need to get out of this cubicle. I quit my job. I sold all of my things, and I ended up backpacking around the world for a year.
Okay, which we should let listeners know we discussed in episode 660 of this program about 3 years ago.
Yes.
And you wrote a book about this called Braver Than You Think.
Yes.
And it set the stage for you to pivot to travel writing as a journalist. I know you wrote a long form, you wrote a book about it, but in terms of your career interest upon return, like after doing that, I have to believe that travel writing was in your DNA if it wasn't there already.
So the interesting thing about that trip is that I was so burnt out from the newspaper world. I didn't intend to become a travel writer. I just, and in fact, I didn't think I would ever write again. And so when I went on this trip, I didn't bring a notebook with me, nothing. I kept a blog for friends and family. But that's when there were a lot of travel blogs. It was like kind of the golden era of travel blogging. And I thought, the world is saturated with travel writing. I have nothing to contribute. I just kept a website for, like I said, friends and family. And I thought, as I'm traveling, I'm going to find what I'm meant to do. And so I tried volunteering along the way. I was a teacher briefly. I taught English. I volunteered at a monkey sanctuary. I volunteered with elephants, and I thought, I'm going to find my calling. And at the end of the trip, all I wanted to do was share the stories from that trip. And I thought, dang it, I guess I'm a writer after all. Along the way, I had picked up a notebook and I started writing more and more about this trip. And so I figured out that travel writing was kind of the next journey for me.
Well, I feel like this confirms my theory that if you are a writer, like what is it? There's like a Lori Moore line about this. Like if you're curious to know whether or not you're a writer, like try to do something else, like anything else.
Right.
And then if you keep writing, despite that, then you can't get away. That's kind of part of it.
I did my best to actively shake it, and writing kept finding me over and over again. And I remember, traveling also gave me the opportunity to read more. And so I had all of these like long bus trips or flights, or I just had a lot of opportunity to read books again. And I started digging into some really beautiful books, and a lot of the writers that I loved, in their bios, it said that they had MFAs. And that kind of planted the seed for me getting an MFA after the trip. And I'm not saying you have to have an MFA to be a travel writer or to be any kind of writer, but that just opened up another doorway for me.
It's a space to go, like, meet people who are also interested in it, and it's a space to find time to work.
Right.
That's how I experienced it. I don't think it's necessary either, but it can be helpful.
Exactly. Yeah, and it gave me just more time to dig into the craft, and that was what I needed, because in newspapers, I didn't really have a lot of, there's not the opportunity to really dig into the craft on a daily basis when you're just trying to meet deadlines and get things in the paper for the next day.
Yeah, I know. I hear that. Like it's not conducive to like really deep dive writing or to like massive revision even because it's so time sensitive. But I think that there is something really useful about that training. Whenever I speak with somebody who is on this show, promoting a book or something, who has worked as a journalist, it tends to serve them well in terms of like not being too precious, being able to just get words on the page. It enforces that discipline upon you. That it's like when people serve in the military, they're really good at getting up early.
Right, exactly.
They never have trouble like waking up at dawn ever again. And I think if you've worked like on the Zanesville courthouse beat or something,
Right.
you are going to be, for the rest of your life, able to get words on the page, even if you don't feel like it.
That's true. Although I will say, in newspapers, when copy editors are trying to make things fit into a certain space on the physical page, the first things that get cut are adjectives. So I learned to write without a lot of color in my stories because it was just cut so often. And so after I left newspapers and I started writing for magazines, I had one editor who looked at a story and he said, "Your newspaper roots are showing." And he definitely meant that as an insult. And I was kind of embarrassed, but that was also it was a sign to me to start working on weaving more color into stories, using adjectives, like kind of delving into the writing a little bit more.
Yeah. 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 It's not like quite so austere. And you do have to, when you're writing travel pieces, it's more atmospheric
Right.
than the typical straight journalism piece or even less straight, right? If anything is going to call for some adjectives, it would be a travel piece or maybe a food piece or something, where it's really sensory.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most difficult thing to overcome with travel writing is that, you're giving people the secondhand experience of something. And so you do have to be very descriptive and give people just a way of understanding what you're talking about. And I remember the first time it really like clicked for me was when I read this essay written by it's a guy named Ryan Knighton, and he wrote an essay for Afar magazine about what it's like going on safari as a traveler who is visually impaired. And he is blind, and he writes about the experience of like first hearing an elephant approaching the vehicle that he's in and then smelling the elephant. And like I get tingles when I think about this story because it was so on point with sensory details, and it's everything that I want my writing to be. I want people to understand like what it's like to be in that moment, the way that he wrote this piece.
I feel like traveling, this has just been my experience of it, but wanting to tell the stories, the impulse to want to share the stories that you accumulate as you travel, especially when you're traveling afar. You're somewhere way outside of your comfort zone or way outside of your cultural context on the other side of the planet. There's a lot of tedium involved in travel, so we can't deny that, right? Like waiting in customs lines and, being in some shitty hotel where the air conditioner breaks or anything, a lot of things go wrong. Logistics can be difficult when it comes to travel, but you do accumulate so many stories. And life, it's so stimulating and interesting to be disoriented.
Yeah. I think that's honestly what I love most about travel is that you are forced to give up any sort of illusion of control. There are just so many things that happen along the way, and you just have to realize like that's life, and that's life when you're traveling, and you have to pivot, you have to figure out a new way. And you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And that's what I think changes a person. It shakes you up. It makes you come home as a different person. And I love that, and also I don't feel like I am particularly vulnerable on a daily basis. But then while I'm traveling, like I'm forced to be vulnerable, and I'm forced to push myself beyond my comfort zone and talk to strangers and ask for help. And I'm vulnerable in a way that I'm not at home. And I like that.
Especially solo travel.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, solo travels, I think really it's a good way to travel, you know, because it really forces you into contact to a greater degree. If you're traveling with a partner or a friend or a group or something, then you can be a little bit insular. You can kind of just talk to each other the whole time. But if you're on your own, you've got to interact and you've got
Yeah.
to be vulnerable, as you say. Like, not only, I mean, there's some physical vulnerability in travel, though I think sometimes this stuff gets overstated, like how dangerous it can be to be in certain parts of the world, when the truth is that if you use some common sense, it's often much better than advertised. But what you're mostly talking about is emotional vulnerability.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I have to say that the most satisfying travel experiences of my life occurred when I was traveling solo and when I did allow myself to just, to be emotionally vulnerable in those moments. I remember I was very, very nervous about traveling to India, and a friend had convinced me to go. And the night before we were supposed to leave, she met a guy and decided to go to Berlin with him. And so
Ah,
I ended up traveling to Mumbai by myself, and it was so wonderful. And I had so many experiences that I wouldn't have had my friend been with me. I met families on trains who pretty much adopted me, and they took me, to their home and to their temple, and gave me cooking lessons. And, I just interacted with people in a way that I wouldn't have had I had a travel partner.
okay, so let's talk. I mean, now's as good a time as any because I'm sure there might be some listeners at home who are wondering about safety issues.
Yes.
Reading people, trusting them enough to go to their homes, you know, all of this sort of stuff. And then add to that the fact that you're a woman traveling solo, which maybe adds an element of vulnerability, or, you know, there might be people who think that that is unsafe. Like, can you talk a little bit about these kinds of issues?
Yeah. So over time, I worked out my own kind of safety system, I guess you would call it. Whenever I travel to a new place, I tend to stay in a more expensive hotel the first night. And it doesn't have to be like the Ritz Carlton. I'm talking like, just as a person who had been traveling in hostels, this was like I would stay in a $25 a night hotel room, or
Whoa.
just something a little more legit, so that so that I knew I had some place to sleep the first night, and then I would spend the next couple days walking different neighborhoods and kind of getting a feel for whatever place I was in, and that would help me determine like which neighborhood I wanted to use as a base. And where I felt safe and where I felt comfortable, and just places where I would find like cafes where I felt comfortable eating, or just any place I felt comfortable. So the first thing was, I would shell out more for a hotel the first night and then find my comfortable place. I also used a lot of networks. Like I would have my friends let me know if they had relatives or, friends in a certain place. So I relied a lot on like friends of friends. I also travel with a hiking pole, and not that I've ever had to use it, but it just made me feel better to think like, okay, I'm carrying a big stick. Like on my first day in a new place, I have this sharp pole, and if I ever needed to use it, like I had something.
Even in a city, you're carrying this thing around?
So I had like, I mean, I just looked like the typical dorky backpacker. I had like a big backpack, and it was like a telescoping hiking pole, but I would use it as like a walking stick. And then
And
after I was,
when you say telescoping, you mean collapsible.
yeah, yeah,
Okay, just so people don't think it's like got dual. It's not like some James Bond device.
no. But that was just when I was initially in a place, for day to day walking around. No, I wouldn't carry a big stick. I would also travel with, and I still travel with, just a cheap little rubber door stop, like a little wedge that goes under the door, so that
Oh, I
because
remember you telling me this.
yeah. Sometimes some of the hostels that I stayed in were a little shady, or some of the hotels, and that just gave me just a little more comfort to know that even if someone unlocked the door, they wouldn't be able to shove their way inside.
Right.
And there was one time where where a proprietor unlocked the door and tried to enter my room in the middle of the night, but I had that little wedge there. So, I was awake for the rest of the night, but but it did its job.
In a ninja pose with your hiking pole, right? Just ready
Right.
to
Yeah.
gut that
Just
guy like a
waiting for
fish.
daylight. Yeah. But I think there's a lot to be said for just trusting your instinct. And also, I firmly believe there are more good people than bad people in the world. And I don't know that I encountered very many bad people.
Yeah, in my travel solo, I remember I almost got mugged once because some dude in the Czech Republic was trying to sell me weed, but he wanted me to walk down basically like a dark alley with him. He's like, come this way. And I started following him, and then all of a sudden I was like, nope. And I just turned around and left. My instincts, I was like, this isn't right. And I'm like 99% sure he was going to pull a knife on me and try to like ask for my wallet if we got clear of like the town square. But you just have to use your instincts.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I'd like to say that I'm a savvy traveler now, that I've been to all these countries, but I'm sure I still get scammed. I'm sure I still pay too much money for things. I just chalk it up to a tourist tax and accept it, and
It's impossible to avoid.
right.
And I think at the same time, I mean, you still get scammed. Nobody's perfect. There's always a learning curve. You're going to make mistakes traveling. That's baked into the cake. But especially on a trip as long as the one you took for a year, all the way around the world, I feel like you do develop like travel muscles.
Right.
Like, if you like by like month 8, you were significantly like more like road tested than you were
Yes.
at the beginning, right? You get good.
Yeah, but now it's a completely different experience because I tend to travel a lot with my child, and so I'm not quite staying in like the shady hostels that I used to, or even the good hostels. I've kind of aged out of hostels, which is a little sad. I liked staying in hostels, so.
I mean, yeah, you can't put your kid on like night watch with the hiking pole.
Right. Or in a
Just
dorm room. Like nobody wants a 9-year-old in their dorm room.
no.
So
And are you? I mean, when you say you're traveling with your child, is this on assignment or is this just
I have taken him out on assignments, yeah. But I haven't taken him on press trips, but he's accompanied me for some things that I've done, like for BBC Travel and other things.
good for him? That's a great thing. I mean, travel's such a great education for anybody at any age, but I think it's got to be fun for you to be able to share that with your kid and to be able
Yeah.
to see his like mind open up and to see his mind get blown when he suddenly finds himself like in Ecuador or whatever it is.
The thing is, he doesn't know any different. So, when he goes back to school, like he just assumes everyone went to interview people on a cacao farm in Belize,
Right.
or
Right.
or that everyone's mom hikes Mount Kilimanjaro. He's just like that's what mom does. So, which I think is really cool. I like that that I'm mentoring that for him and kind of showing him the world.
Yeah, it leaves a deep impression. Like even if he's not necessarily like verbalizing it or demonstrating it somehow, like that stuff imprints itself on you. Like I have to believe. And when it comes to travel writing as compared to other forms of writing, are there things that you found that distinguish it? Obviously you kind of talked a bit about it with respect to straight journalism and kind of the more austere reportage that you were doing earlier in your career. But can you talk just a little bit about the things that distinguish travel writing?
Yeah, so there are many forms of travel writing. I know people who write guidebooks, even though that's not a form I've ever done myself. There are reviews, how-to guides, a lot of lists. I'm sure you've seen like the 5 best beaches in Mykonos, or like that type of thing. Destination pieces. marketing copy and narrative essays. And so a challenge for me when I was entering the travel writing world was kind of figuring out where I fit into those different formats. I think I prefer writing narratives and essays, just figuring out like what it all means when you're traveling. I also love destination pieces and really like digging into the vibe of a place and describing that for people. And mentally, one thing I had to get over was, for a while, I felt like travel pieces weren't important. And then over time, I realized, travel writing, first of all, it involves so many great things about like a food of a place and the culture and history. And you can really dig into some really important themes and talk about different issues with travel writing. But also, when you're writing an article about a place, you're helping someone else eventually have the best day of their life, or make meaningful memories with their families, or see the world through a new lens. And I can't think of anything more noble than that. So
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like this conversation happened a lot around, like, for example, Anthony Bourdain's show and the work that he did, which nominally is like it's a travel show. It's food porn. There's all these different ways to characterize it or minimize it. But the reason it was so resonant and popular is that it's really a human thing. And
right.
it's shrinking the world. It's showing people places that they might not otherwise see. But it's also, at its deepest levels, I think, showing us our common humanity,
Yes.
And I think travel writing performs the same function.
Right. I think it really helps cultivate empathy in people, and I love that about travel writing. I also feel like we're in a time where intelligence is artificial and so many things are virtual, and people just want reality again. And people are going to start to want these real human experiences and to know about other people. And, we live in a time where it's easier than ever to exist in a bubble and to be around people who are like you. And so anytime there's an opportunity to share the world through someone else's eyes or to elevate other voices, I think that's really important.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it would be good for any country, but like since we're Americans, let's just say the United States of America, to elevate the importance of international travel as a national value. And even to the point where you might subsidize it, like somehow for like, postgraduate students to be able to go travel for 6 months or a year and to get some sort of stipend. I don't know how it works, but I want to say in Australia, that's the country I always think of where I feel like everybody has gone on a big international sojourn. It seems that way, and other countries too, but it's just good for people, and it's good for the health of humanity and the planet for folks to get outside of their little bubble.
Yeah. Just traveling has challenged my beliefs in so many ways and opened my eyes. And every time I travel, I come home a new person, which I'm so grateful for. But also, I think it's possible to do that just by leaving your house or, finding something new in your
Wait, what do you
neighborhood
mean?
or,
What do you mean leave the house?
right.
What are you talking about?
And so I don't want your listeners to think that like international is the only way to travel or the only way to be a travel writer, because, you know, I live in, I just relocated outside of Palm Springs, but I've lived in Palm Springs for 15 years now. And it's a place where a lot of tourists come. And so I end up making, the bulk of my money writing about the place where I live. So you can get started with travel stories where you are.
Well, regionally too. I mean, there's
Oh, yeah.
so many places to explore in California and the Southwest. You can get to Mexico. I mean, there's plenty to explore here. I feel like I've just scratched the surface of understanding California, and I've been here 20 some odd years. There's a lot It's infinite. There's no way to exhaust it all. And when we talk about travel writing and the different areas that you explore and the places that you might cover, and kind of identifying yourself within the genre and specializing somehow, like, can you talk about finding your beat?
Yeah.
And like, is it something that you sort of self-declare? Is it something that you kind of find in tandem with an editor or with a particular magazine? Like, how does that happen?
So I don't know how other writers do it, but when I started, I found a travel writer that I thought was similar in writing styles, and I looked at her, and she was much more accomplished than I was. And I looked at her list of credentials, like all the bylines that she had had over the years. And so I turned that into my own byline bucket list. And I thought, I'm similar to her. I have totally different ideas, but our styles were the same. So I'm going to try to get pieces in these same outlets. And I just ticked them off one by one. I just started by getting those bylines, and I'm also very motivated by spite. And so I felt like this woman has what I don't, and I want that. And so, and we don't even know each other. Like, she has no idea.
Who is this woman?
I'm not going to tell you. Um, but, then once I achieved that, then I had a pretty good idea of the types of pieces I was good at writing. And then now, I think my niche kind of shifts along with my interests. Like, I love writing about adventure travel. I love outdoor experiences and also meaningful family travel. But then when I look at a story and I think, like a travel story, and I think, oh, I could have written that, then that's what I know. Like, that's my niche. That's what I should be writing about.
So just to underline it, I think what you're saying is read deeply in the genre.
Right.
If you want to be a travel writer, then read other travel writing and
Right.
figure out what you respond to and keep track of it. Like,
Right.
have a real clear sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, also see what makes you angry.
Yeah. Right?
Well, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but living in Palm Springs, people would come into town and they would write stories about Palm Springs, and I would think, like, I could have done this, or I should have done this, or I would have done this better. And so then I started specializing in the California desert. And then, I'm 3 years sober now. So sober travel is another niche that I write into. And I started doing that because, first of all, I was looking for stories just as a traveler, looking for, other people who were writing about this, and I couldn't find much. And so I started doing that because there was a need to be filled. So I write a lot about that. Yeah, just,
That seems smart. Like, I read the piece that you wrote about Vegas,
oh yeah.
like, which is, by the way, a hotbed of sober travel. So many sober people in Las
Yeah.
Vegas, just wandering, just in a very calm, completely placid, sober state of mind through those casinos. It's wonderful.
But that was a travel experience that really surprised me because I didn't think I would come out of that Vegas experience with any stories. I'm much more, I love to write about the natural world, and there's not a lot of natural stuff in Vegas. There is once you get outside, but I didn't think I would end up getting any stories out of that particular trip. And just the experience of being sober in Vegas and thinking about some of my previous travel in Vegas when I had been drinking, I think that creates a natural drama and tension, and just, encountering the ghosts of my past. Like, that's worth mining for me. And so that ended up being a really gratifying trip. It was not straight travel. It was more about the human experience.
And I think for somebody who is sober, just to get in and out of Vegas without falling off the wagon, you're like victory.
Yeah.
You know, like not that I'm sure you were fine. I mean, I can't, you seem like you're not white knuckling it, though I guess everybody has their days, but you know, I feel like certain places and certain experiences are just so kind of, it's like so routine. Like getting fucked up is part of being in Las Vegas almost.
Right.
And I should say too that like the travel world, especially when you're on the hostel circuit, you know, and you're staying at hostels, I feel like binge drinking and pot smoking is kind of de rigueur in those scenarios. You know, I'm
Oh,
sure
yeah.
you were exposed to a lot of that.
Well, I was drinking at the time when I
I
was
know.
doing that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's part of why I hit my lifetime limit. I think I
Well,
was,
I don't know you that well, but you don't strike me as somebody who is like super, like living like a rock star life. But I relate to this. Like I'm essentially sober. Like I haven't declared sobriety or anything. Like I may drop acid tomorrow for all I know, or like smoke a joint. Like I don't have like a lock on it. I'm just too old. I
yeah,
can't do it anymore. I don't want to do it. I have no interest in a hangover, like zero.
yeah,
I think and so I don't know. Kudos to you for recognizing it and pulling the plug, right?
yeah. You know, when I was newly sober, I went to Greece, and Greece is a country where people are so kind and so generous. Like there were people always offering me alcohol, and that was so even though I wasn't there to party and I wasn't going to clubs or anything like that, there were just such just so much kindness where people would bring me, you know, a whole bottle of liquor and so there was a moment where I was on the island of Naxos and I thought, I'm just going to look for an AA meeting. And I looked on this app and it said the closest one was 7 miles away. And I was like, oh, that's great. That's not too far. And then I realized it was on an entirely different island. and, and so it's experiences like that. Like I want to write about that for other sober travelers. You know, it's just kind of the thing you don't think about and you don't necessarily find in a guidebook.
Yeah, and it's good to kind of own your little niche. I mean, that's
Yeah.
like, and by the way, you're far from the only person who is sober and traveling and probably thinking about this stuff. So you've got an audience. It's not like a super tiny niche,
Right. And I
but I,
think more people are sober curious now, or they're, you know, they're on a cleanse or just whatever. They're making the decision to abstain for whatever reason.
and I think there are also people, I mean, this is sort of my category. It's like alcohol's just poison. I get that like a glass of wine can be delicious. Like, you know, I'm not trying to like shame people, but it's really just like a liquid toxin
Right.
that makes you,
Yeah.
and as you get older, you feel like absolute dog shit if you have like 3 glasses of it. Like it's probably not great for you. I think there are people who are like, maybe like a gummy or like eating some mushrooms twice a year is the way to go. Like do the plant thing, you know,
Yeah. That's
instead of like,
California sober.
that's right,
Yeah.
California sober, but I
Uh,
think California sober is advisable and for many people.
Yeah, I mean, I was finding myself, I would wake up and I would work out for an hour just to get all the alcohol out of my body. And then I thought, you know, what if I just skipped that step? Where,
Right.
like, what if I didn't do that? And then, and so that opened up just a lot more time and opportunity for me when I just cut that part of the equation out.
Yeah, the complete like detox, like hour in your morning. Good thing you live in the desert. You know, it's hot out. You can just walk around outside for an hour, be completely dehydrated to the point of almost passing out. But the alcohol has been, you know, dispatched.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so here's a question that I imagine you know, a listener at home might be contemplating, which is like where to start. You have no experience and you want to do this, you want to get a foothold somewhere. I know it's like there's not a one size fits all answer, but like just in general, like what is a good way for people to begin?
So I'd say start where you are. and you can get some bylines writing about the place where you live, because nobody knows that place better than you do. So there are a lot of things about the place where I live where I just think like, oh, that's weird. Somebody should write about that, and I guess it's me because I know about it. So whatever makes you curious, whatever like really lights you up inside. One travel story that I really loved doing, even though it didn't take me outside of Palm Springs, I found some hobo symbols like carved into the dirt near some train tracks. And I only know that they were hobo symbols because my family came from, my grandfather worked on the railroad. And so I had always heard about this hobo code of like secret symbols that hobos used. So I started digging into it, and I found people who like run a hobo museum, and people who are experts in like graffiti and in, you know, the codes that people use to communicate as they travel. And so that was just a really fun story, that it was just me being curious, and like and that turned out to be just worth digging into. So I'm sure there are weird things and quirky things or interesting things wherever a person is.
Start local,
Start
possibly.
local, yes. Read a lot of travel magazines, read publications. I think a lot of beginners believe that the only
Wait.
place.
I want to stop you. What are some travel publications, like just some popular ones?
Yeah, so there's like Travel and Leisure, Condé Nast Traveler, Afar. But I think beginners kind of get hung up thinking those are the only travel publications. And when you start thinking about a travel story in a broader sense, you realize it can be in a lot of different publications that aren't exclusively devoted to travel. So it might be a food story, or it might be, something historical, and that really opens up the number of places that you can pitch it to.
Okay. So when it comes to pitching, like somebody might say, you know what, I live in Chicago, so I'm going to start here or nearby. And let's just say they are going to write a story about like Wrigley Field, just to be super basic about it.
Right.
And then they say, well, I want to pitch this to a travel magazine. People don't realize you can take a tour of Wrigley Field, and it's actually quite interesting, and there's lots of Chicago history embedded into it, whatever it is. The pitching process, especially for a rookie,
Right.
like what do? You just like find publications that you think might fit, search the masthead, and then send an email and cross your fingers? Like, what are some of the do's and don'ts?
Okay, so like with any publication that I pitch, I first search their archives to make sure they haven't written something about that in the past. I also come up with a specific story angle or what's new about it, so that there's a reason for me to be writing it.
Okay. When you say search the archives, are those typically online, or do you go to
Typically
what?
online.
Okay.
But I do use my local library a lot. Like I go back through the most recent editions to make sure that a magazine hasn't already covered something, or I search online, or I just do some Google searches too, just to make sure there's, that I'm not pitching something that they've already done, because that's very embarrassing.
Yeah, it's like bad manners.
I mean, I cringe when I think back to some of the pitches that I've sent, and some of them weren't even pitches. Like I remember sending off an email. God, I can't even believe I'm admitting this. I sent an email to an editor that said like, "Hey, I'm headed to Portland. Do you need any stories?" No, they don't need any stories from a person
Right.
they don't know. Like
Right.
and also I wasn't giving them any ideas. I wasn't, presenting them with an actual story. So a story usually has something new about it, or it has some, interesting character. It's a good profile of someone. There has to be some reason for telling that story. And then because editors are very busy, and if you're doing cold pitching, you're already starting at a disadvantage. So I like to make it as easy as possible for the editor to understand what I'm pitching. And so I tend to find another story in their publication that is similar in tone, even if it's not the same topic whatsoever. So I can say, like, hey, this will be a reported essay similar in tone to the article about whatever, Manitoba, that you had in the March issue. And that way the editor can look at it and have a very, clear idea of what I'm pitching. And because they're already familiar with that previous story and they know that you've been reading the publication.
Which, yeah, is like a nice courtesy and just like a feather in your cap, you
Right.
know. In terms of how long a pitch is, what a pitch letter contains or what a pitch email contains, it's obviously got to contain a thumbnail of what you're proposing. I don't think you want to go on and on about what this thing's going to be. You just want to make it clear and concise,
Right.
so that they have as full a grasp as possible as quickly as possible. But aside from that, what do you include? Like, I guess if you have some bylines, you might include some of those.
Yeah. So I tend to do the introduction saying, like, I'm proposing a story like this, similar to another story that appeared in your publication. I give them a brief overview, like maybe 3 sentences of what the story is about. I say, like, if I have sources that I've already talked to or potential sources that I anticipate interviewing for the piece, I say, my sources would include this person, this person, this person. And then I include a little about me with, 2 or 3 sentences with links to some of my clips.
So like one screen. They don't have to do much scrolling on their email.
Right. I include links whenever possible. And I do the bulk of the legwork before I send the pitch. So there's not a lot that I still have to do after the story has been accepted.
Okay. But I mean, does that ever wasted motion? Have you ever had a story not get accepted after doing all
Yeah,
that legwork?
I have a
Yeah.
ton of them. But
But it,
I mean, that's the thing. I feel like, I have so many story ideas there. It's just not possible for me to pitch them all and find the right place. It's, I have
yeah.
a lot of stories that I'm really dying to tell. So,
Okay, so a couple of questions.
yeah.
First of all, like in terms of pitching an editor, when somebody's looking at a masthead, like Travel and Leisure, for example, how do you know which editor to pitch?
Sometimes the publications have a pitch guide, and so you can Google Travel and Leisure pitching, and I believe they have a whole page that says, if you're pitching for our website, contact this person. If you're pitching for, luxury hotels, contact this person or whatever, and they break it down so that you're sending it to the right place. Sometimes I also will Google like Travel and Leisure editor Twitter and see who pops up to see like, Twitter is not as reliable now as it used to be, but it used to
Yeah.
be that a lot of editors were available on Twitter. I check LinkedIn to make sure the person is still at that publication. Like I really do a lot of legwork to make sure that it gets to the right person because that I think increases your chances. I never anymore just send out like a pitch to 10 different people at the same time or anything like that. I
You
very
don't?
much custom write a pitch for the publication.
Have you ever pitched somebody on Twitter?
Not on Twitter, but you find calls for pitches on Twitter or you find the editor's information on Twitter. I think
Okay.
it's really a bad move to slide into an editor's DMs unless
Okay,
they
good to know.
ask for it.
Yeah. So a second question has to do with being generative, and you talked about having all these ideas and so many different pitches and so many different stories that you want to write. It's because you're interested in this stuff and you're a travel writer and everything else. But, in order to be consistently generative, you have to, I always say input equals output. You have to be reading a lot in the genre. You have to be like poking around online or in newspapers and reading about places and figuring out what's interesting to you, right? Is that how you sustain, yourself and keep yourself generative?
Yeah, you know, I think I'm pretty generative with stories. The hardest part for me is prioritizing. Like, okay, I want to keep pitching this story because it's important to me, and not just like chasing every new story idea that I have. And so that's hard for me, is like just before we got on this call, I saw someone who does fortune telling with cheese, and I was like, I want to write an article about that. And then I had
Where
to
is
tell
this?
like I had to tell myself, like, no, focus. I have all these other stories that I'm pitching that I want to write first. That's probably, I can't just keep chasing stories.
Where is the psychic with cheese?
Chicago.
Oh,
Yeah.
that
I'm,
makes some sense.
yeah. It's apparently a thing. It's a divination tool, just like reading tea leaves. You look at the curds. Who
Yeah.
knew? I just, and like, that's not a travel story, but it's really interesting to me. I have another story coming up that was another thing that I thought was just really interesting, and it's about cow hugging therapy. And so I'm writing about that for Outside Magazine, and that's something that I pitched to a couple different places, and I think Outside is a really good home for it.
Sure, sure. And so let's kind of like go through the process. Like, you have come up with a great pitch, you've written your great pitch letter, you've located the right editor, or you've followed the pitch guide for whatever publication that you're pitching. You are advising that you should pitch one place at a time, or at least a small number of places in a batch.
I pitch a small number of places. If it's something exclusive, or if I have a really good feeling that it's perfect for one specific place, I'll pitch them and wait until I hear from them. Or if it's an editor that I've been working with, I kind of give them first dibs, just to be kind. Or like, if I think it's a really good fit, then I genuinely want to place it with them. And then I move on from there, and I will change the pitch depending on the publication. So, like, what works for the Financial Times, wouldn't be the same thing that works for, Condé Nast Traveler. It's just different styles. So,
How many subscriptions to magazines do you have? Like, I guess you go into the library a lot to look at these things, because you do have to familiarize yourself with all these different styles and just the way that they do it.
right, yeah. I do have a lot of subscriptions, but yeah, I do go to the library a lot. I'm also lucky enough to work for a university, so I get some archives that way.
Sure. So, in terms of feedback, like, you pitch somebody, is there a general turnaround time that you're accustomed to? I know it probably varies some, but like, what can a person expect once you've pitched to hear back? And do you hear back? Do you sometimes just get ghosted totally and nobody says anything? I
Yeah,
got to imagine.
I mean, most of the time, you just don't hear from someone. And I follow up within a week or two. And that has been really great. Like, I keep track of who I've pitched. I return to it a week later or 2 weeks, depending on the time of year. Like, sometimes if it's around holidays or something, I want to give them more time. And sometimes it's just following up is all it takes. And maybe the editor missed it the first time around, or meant to respond and didn't. But I like to give them the opportunity, but then after that, I leave it, because I don't want to be a nag either. So after that, I just assume it's a no, and I move on to other publications. And then sometimes, I'll have a piece that I think is a really great idea, and it's just not a fit, and I haven't found a placement for it, but then something comes along months later where it's perfect. So I had an idea after I was in Iceland. I learned about the problems that the baby puffins have. They get confused, kind of like sea turtles, where they go toward the lights of the city instead of going out to sea. And that's what happens with these baby puffins. You know, they start to go into town where they're eaten by cats or hit by cars, and they die instead of going out to the ocean where they're meant to be. And so there are a bunch of children who, during puffling season, they go out in the middle of the night. They call themselves the Puffling Patrol. They gather up the puffins in cardboard boxes, and then in the morning they toss them out to sea like fuzzy little baseballs. And I
This
thought,
is adorable.
I know. I was like, I love the Puffling Patrol. I pitched it to a bunch of places, and nobody was responsive. But then Atlas Obscura was putting together a book about wildlife stories around the world. And I thought, aha, like I've got a story for you. And so it's perfect for that book. And so it will be in that book whenever it comes out.
So timing matters.
Right. And, you
in-
know,
in
sometimes
life.
just hang on to it because you never know when it's going to find that perfect fit.
That's right. That's right. So when you get a yes, what does that look like?
Usually all the yeses come all at once, and then I stress out, and I spend a lot of days drinking a lot of coffee and just getting all the articles done. I mean, it goes in waves, honestly. There are lots of times where I have nothing and I think I'm never going to write again. And then there are times when I have, 10 stories on my plate, which is really great and rewarding.
Okay, but okay, so like let's say you pitch this, you want to go to Iceland,
Right.
just as an example, and such magazine says, yes, we're going to send you to Iceland. Like they pay for your trip. Like how does the money work?
Oh, well, that is not my forte. I am very travel broke in that any money I make from writing about travel goes directly into more travel. Um, it's very rare anymore for a publication to send you out on assignment. They're more likely to accept something from a trip that you have already taken, or if you are going somewhere and have a really firm idea of the story you're going to write while you're there. So, like I did stories from Belize after I returned from Belize, and that was self-funded, but it was also but I wrote about it to the point where that covered all of my travel.
Right.
So, and then also, some writers go on press trips, some don't. It's kind of there's some tension in the travel world. There are some publications that you can't pitch if you have received compensation in any way, whether that's a press trip or a media rate on a hotel or something like that.
I was going to say, because I feel like I have a friend who does this, goes on these fabulous trips, like they're press trips.
Yeah.
And they put you up at like this 5-star hotel and they take you out horseback riding and like they show you a great time so that you'll write about it favorably in
Right.
like the Times or whatever. But that typically, like if you're going on a trip to say Iceland, you're not calling ahead to some hotel and being like, hey, by the way, I'm a travel writer. I'm coming to town. Can you give me a rate?
So you can, and I've done that, but I do that when I fully intend to write about the place. I know that some writers are just, like everyone, we're all looking for a break.
Right.
Things are expensive now. But I don't want to receive a discount on something unless I 100% intend to write about them in some way. So I will ask for a discount in some cases. Sometimes I just, find the cheapest accommodation possible if I have no intention of writing about like the hotel.
Okay. And so like even like Condé Nast Traveler, like they're not sending people out to cover stuff, or you try to use writers who are like local to a place to cover?
Right. For some of the features, they are. For just like a digital story, no, they're using someone who's local or someone who has already done the trip, or they're doing someone who's doing like, reporting from their desk. So that's possible too.
Yeah, I remember when I was just out of college, one of my first jobs was to be like a magazine writer for like Stuff magazine, these like bro mags.
Yeah.
And I had to write some article. It was like the best places in the world to get laid. I was living at home with my parents at the time, so I just had total authority.
Yeah.
But it was like Miami International Airport. And I'm like picking these places just out of a hat that I've never been to and just winging it, you know. I
Yeah.
didn't realize that was how it worked. My editor was like, oh, yeah, just, try to figure it out. Call somebody there and ask them. And I think I called the Miami airport somehow. I was like, what's a good place to have sex in Miami airport? And some guy was like telling me. So anyway, memories, my esteemed career
That's
as a
hilarious.
journalist.
But I have gone on press trips, and again, with press trips, I only accept them if I am pretty much fully confident that I will write about the places that I'm going, or will get stories from it. Like, I know sometimes people will just take a free trip because it's a free trip. I think it's just up to the writer.
Yeah. I mean, a little bit of that. You got to cover expenses somehow, especially if these magazines aren't paying you,
Right.
to do this stuff. I mean, you got to make it work somehow. It's expensive to travel abroad.
I think, honestly, I really hope some publications change that policy, because I think it's another form of gatekeeping. You're not getting all the voices that you could potentially get.
It's got to be somebody who can afford the trip.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So what about being on the ground and like sifting through all that happens during a big trip and like winnowing it down into a serviceable story that people are going to enjoy reading? Like there has to come a time for you, probably when you return, I would imagine, though maybe occasionally when you're out there in the field, where you've got to make sense of your experience.
Yeah. So what I do, I spend a lot of time walking when I'm in a new place. I like to get a sense of the layout of the place, and that's also just how I write and think and process, is that I do a lot of walking. So I like to get a real feel by moving through the place in that way. I take notes in that they're like bullet point notes in a notebook. I also take a lot of pictures, because I feel like just having a phone that can take pictures is a really great tool for a writer, so that I can go back and look, and I'm able to describe something really fully. And then after the trip, you just look for the memories that rise to the top, like the things that really resonate with you and that you continue to think about. And sometimes it's a really spectacular meal. Sometimes it's, like an experience that you had, or a person that you met, a connection that you made. It can be anything, but just look for what is really unique and interesting that sticks for you. Also, I think there's something to be said for, like, as much as I am an activity person, like when I travel, I say yes to everything. If someone's like, hey, we could go ziplining, yes, I will do that, anything. So I do try to engage with as many activities as possible, but I also like to carve out some time just for being like still there and just kind of absorbing a place. And there's a Pico Iyer quote where he says, "It's impossible to be moved if you're not sitting still." And so I try to allow some time for being still in a place, just for letting it kind of seep into my bones.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I always say, is that it's great to go on a vacation for a week or 10 days or something. It's always great. But if you really want to be able to get a feel for a place, you sort of have to hang around long enough to get bored, long enough to just sit there. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like if you're on like some frenetic tour of 3 different European capitals in 10 days, like great, that'll be fun. You'll have a lot of memories and it's better to go than to not go. But if you actually want to get to know these places, you need more time. You're better off like kind of embedding yourself into like an Airbnb or something in some neighborhood and grocery shopping and like living there a little bit. But that's not always doable.
Yeah, that's another thing that I like to do, if possible, if there's enough time. I like to do the same things that I do at home, but just in other places. Like going to the movies is really interesting in other countries, because I can tell you going to the movies in Bangkok is very different than going in Rwanda. And I've gotten some great stories out of doing things like that. Or, you know, I even though I
What's
don't.
the difference? But what's the difference between going to the movies in Thailand versus going in
So in
Rwanda?
Bangkok, I had a very luxurious experience where like you have your own box seat and people were bringing me food and blankets and it was very posh. And then when I went to the movies in Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda, I showed up at the local movie theater, I say with air quotes, and they were waiting for someone to bring a DVD. And the movie that they showed was just whatever movie somebody would bring that night. So, I mean, it was like inevitably some Fast and Furious movie or something. But you never knew what movie they were showing because it was all chance. It was just whatever someone would bring that night.
It's sort of fun.
It
It adds
was.
an element of suspense.
And so, I mean, and they were both great experiences, but that's something really boring that you wouldn't necessarily make time for when you're traveling. But it was just interesting to see how other people go to the movies. And even though I don't eat McDonald's at home, really, I try to always go to McDonald's in different places because I really like their regional menus and to see what they have.
What have you seen?
So in Taiwan, I had a really great corn soup at McDonald's, and in India, I had a McPaneer, like just a big thick slab of fried cheese on a bun, and it was incredible, honestly.
Wow,
Yeah.
good for India. So what about like the ethics? There are ethical questions that are raised increasingly so in our time of like great, climate change and global weirding and all these, wildfires and hurricanes and floods and everything. Obviously, air travel contributes considerably to like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and there are some people who are saying like travel less. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
and we need less tourism and not more, and all this stuff. So, where do you fall on that?
I mean, that's the struggle. That's something that I believe every travel writer needs to reckon with is the fact that we want to see the world, but in seeing it, we're also killing it. And I don't know that there's an easy answer like travel less. I don't necessarily think that's the key. I think demanding more sustainable travel is good. I think we need to demand more efficient planes. We need to urge the people in power to do something about it. I'm seeing an increasing number of places that are prioritizing sustainability, which I think is the future of travel. And then when I do travel, I do so with intention, and I try not to contribute to the problem. Like I don't want to go and be a source of like plastic waste. I always bring my own water bottle and my own. I have this thing called a SteriPen, which is like a UV cleaner for your water, so it makes it safe to drink, so that I'm
Wait,
not
what is
buying.
this? What is this thing called?
It's called a SteriPen. It was actually purchased by a different company recently, so I don't know what the new name is. But it's like a UV light. It's about the size of a Sharpie, and you put it in your water for 60 seconds, and then it makes it safe to drink. And so I'm not buying water bottles all over the place because I'm just refilling my Nalgene bottle everywhere that I go. And I feel like that makes a big difference, when you're not using up plastic. Like, I don't know that I'm going to change the world, but I'm not making it worse, I hope. That's my
Yeah.
goal, is to leave
You just want to
everything.
try to have a smaller footprint. I know
Yeah.
you can you can buy carbon offsets. I've heard of people doing that when they take an
Yeah.
international flight. They buy some sort of carbon offset to sort of balance out the equation. But it's so hard, like you say. You gotta live, and I don't think world travel or travel in general is going to stop. People are always going to travel. They're always going to want to travel, and it's not an unhealthy impulse.
Right. And, there's even emerging tourism based on climate change, which I think is really interesting and also very sad. There's called eco-necro tourism, which is going to see threatened places before they die off.
Oy, yeah,
So, and and there are arguments to be made for it. Right now, like, one of the biggest topics in the travel world is going to Antarctica. Like, you're definitely dooming Antarctica by going, but some people argue that the only way to preserve a place is to generate interest in it, and you generate interest in it by traveling there and telling people about it. So again, I don't know that there is one right answer. I think every person, every traveler, every travel writer needs to determine that for themselves.
yeah. I think there's a difference between tourism and traveling too. I mean, it's like it's a little bit blurry, but there's like it's one thing to like go to Disney World, and it's another thing to go to Kigali. And like just I think it's also it's attitudinal. Like it's like the way that you occupy space and the way that you move through a place, like you're saying, and what your motivation is. If you're just trying to like hit all the sites and get your selfie with your selfie stick, that's one way to do it. But there's also the person who's sort of like knocking around for a month to sort of see what happens and is trying to write something, or I don't know. It
Yeah.
just there's different modes.
I think also it's interesting to see how travel has shifted since Instagram was invented. When I did my backpacking trip, that was in 2010, 2011, and I've since traveled a lot since then, and entire places have changed because of Instagram, because people are just trying to get that picture. And now there are places set up for you to encounter, like, people in traditional outfits, or like just certain pictures doing it for the gram. And I don't know why someone would do that. Like, I don't know why you'd go so far to feel so little, because you're not making a real connection with the place. You're not necessarily learning anything authentic about the place. But then, I don't know. I don't know that you can define also what authentic is when you travel. So,
I don't know. I think it's pitiful to just all these people with their. I mean, look, get a photo. Wherever you are, you want to get a photo, get a photo. But there are people who are like literally just like ticking boxes and like trying to like glamorize themselves in these places, and it's like the deepest they go in terms of trying to understand a place, and it's pitiful. Like what a waste.
Right on the heels of my backpacking trip, I had an old friend who contacted me, and he said, I really want to travel like you, but I don't know how. If I pay for you to go around Europe with me, will you come? And I said, yes, of course. And so he bought my tickets, and then we traveled together we did a road trip through 16 different countries within a month. And it really was like, at the time, there was a list on Facebook of places to see before you die, and he really wanted to tick off as many of those as possible. And so that determined our route through these multiple countries. And we were just like driving up, getting a picture, and then driving on to the next location. And it really taught me a lot about how I don't want to travel. But at the same time, like, this was a person who, he wasn't comfortable traveling on his own. And I think it did push him a little bit beyond his limits. And so, or beyond his, comfort zone. And so that is equally valuable. He did, get to see some things. So I don't know that there's a wrong way to travel, but it's not necessarily the way that I would do it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's to each their own, teach their own. And I want to ask you before I let you go about, like, I guess this is a larger career question, and it's just like a viability question in terms of trying to make some semblance of a living and to keep going and to keep being able to do this work. And, there's, I don't think anybody listening to my show would be surprised to learn that, like, publishing in media is a fraught business and it's hard to make a living in it. But you are working consistently. You are, filing stories for a lot of different publications. You have been doing a lot of cool traveling and travel-related writing. Can you talk a little bit about the way that you envision or hope to integrate perhaps the journalism work that you do with possible future book projects? It seems like you got to kind of create an ecosystem. Mm-hmm. It's like maybe you have a podcast or a YouTube channel. Kara and Nate, those traveling youngsters, on YouTube. My daughter introduced me to these people. She loves them. And I'm like, these guys have built a lucrative little business just traveling the world and creating these videos, mm-hmm. So I'm just curious to know, especially from a writerly perspective, how you conceive of it.
Man, I would love to be some kind of travel influencer, but I'm not comfortable enough to be on camera for that. Sometimes I go on press trips with influencers, and it's really interesting to see the differences between the journalists and the magazine writers and the influencers. And it's I'm very jealous of them, but it's also hard work and in a different way. I would love to have a YouTube channel where I could do that, but I'm very much I still think I have those newspaper roots where I'm much more comfortable behind a notebook or a computer. As far as long term, my next book project, I have been reporting from multiple places. I see it as more research driven than any of my previous books. So my first book was a travel memoir. My next book, which is coming out in March, is called 50 Things to Do Before You're 5. And that's kind of gentle adventures for families with young children. And that, I'm not encouraging families I'm not saying go to the Great Wall of China. I'm saying go on a smell walk around your neighborhood or visit an art museum, things like that. But again, it's just cultivating that love of travel in young children. And then the book project I'm working on now is much more reported work, and I think it's more aligned with my background in journalism. I don't want to talk about it too much, but because I feel like I've already kind of sucked the energy out of it by talking about it. But it does involve travel, and I'm hoping that the magazine work that I do along the way will help sustain the reporting of it. And then,
so it's a work of nonfiction.
It is a work of nonfiction,
and it is travel related, but it's actually it's like a long form, nonfiction narrative of some kind that takes place elsewhere.
Yes, yeah. So that book Salt, that looked at many different aspects of the history of salt and cultivating salt all over the world. So kind of like that, an obsessive look at one thing from different places around the world.
Okay.
And in my dreams, I would love to have a media empire where I could just put all of these weird, fun stories that I find all over the world. Look at this cool shit that I found, That's the dream. And I don't know if that is a digital publication or finding a way to put it in another book in the future. But I think there are just so many stories to tell out there, and I just don't have the capacity to pitch them all.
Look at all this cool shit I found.com is available. I just looked on GoDaddy, so you might want to lock that one up.
Come on,
Or you
Brad.
could
It
call
would be called Magazine.
or gentleadventures.com.
Yeah.
It's been so fun to talk to you. This is such a cool topic to get to discuss. And it's, I love to travel. I don't do nearly enough of it, but maybe I will soon after talking to you. Maybe I'll just go book something right now. Just swipe that credit card and take off.
Do it. Do it. I do that sometimes.
All right. Well, listen, really appreciate the time. Best of luck with this next book project and with all that you have going.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be on your show and a pleasure. Thank you so much.